Over the last 2 weeks, not necessarily today, but over the last 2 weeks, a re-examination of that product, how it's used, and what kinds of money and margin are needed for that, and position limits are needed for that, will certainly be under review.
Any forecast, Mr. Phelan, on what is likely to happen tomorrow after this crazy day today?
Well, I'm like everybody else in America. I'm praying for an up day, not a down one.
But you have no real reason to expect it can go one way or the other?
No, it's very difficult at this point in time to tell.
Thank you very much, John Phelan, who's the chairman of the New York Stock Exchange.
Thank you.
A number of factors contributed to today's record loss, and no one was blaming any one development for setting off the selling binge. By day's end, however, everyone was looking to Washington for some action. But as NBC's Andrea Mitchell reports now, there was confusion there as well.
The president tried to ignore the market's plunge, continuing to brag about what Republicans like to call the Reagan recovery.
This month we'll set a record, the longest peacetime economic expansion on record.
On paper, the economy looks good.
The leading indicators are sending a message, steady as she goes.
But the markets were anything but steady, and as panic took hold on Wall Street, the administration tried to blame Congress for scaring big business by proposing higher taxes. Just yesterday, Treasury Secretary Baker made that point.
I think that the stock market. Hong Kong sellers were even rougher. Their market plunged 420. That's a drop of 11% in one day. The world is also worried that the dollar could fall again, and the U.S. would have to put up interest rates to protect it. That could stifle world growth, which already looks shaky.
An important feature of all the foreign markets. Volume has not been heavy so far. Many stockbrokers were saying, don't worry, it's only a correction. But now, as they've seen the New York market plunge again, the question must be, what will happen when the Asian and the European markets open a few hours from now? Rodney Smith, ABC News, London.
In a moment, we'll get the reaction in Washington, and we'll talk with a couple of influential men in the market itself.
Prudent yet restrained response to that Iranian missile attack last week on an oil tanker flying the American flag. NBC News Pentagon correspondent Fred Francis has more tonight.
It was called Operation Nimble Archer. The Iranian oil rig was the target for 1,065 high-explosive shells during the 85-minute bombardment from 4 Navy destroyers. It was 1:40 in the afternoon in the Persian Gulf when as many as 30 Iranian soldiers heard a terse warning from the USS Thatch. Quote, "This is the U.S. Navy. We will commence firing on your position at 1400 hours. You have 20 minutes to evacuate the platform." End quote. Some men did evacuate, but at one point during the intense shelling from 5-inch guns like these, an Iranian radioed a plea to the Navy to stop firing so that wounded could be removed. The Navy ignored the plea. Defense Secretary Weinberger called the small oil rig the most appropriate military target for U.S. retaliation.
This platform had been used to mount radar surveillance, to report on convoy movements, to launch small boat attacks against non-belligerent shipping in the central Gulf waters, and last week to fire at U.S. military helicopters.
The Pentagon said another oil platform was also evacuated during the shelling. Navy SEALs boarded it and blew up radar and radio equipment. The oil platforms may have been an irritant to the Naval Task Force, but Pentagon sources say they were the least significant of all possible targets considered. The Pentagon decided against destroying the Silkworm missile sites along the Strait of Hormuz and the Fall Peninsula, or Revolutionary Guard bases on 3 islands, and striking the bases at Bandar Abbas and Bushehr were ruled out as too provocative.
Hitting a more valuable target, like the missile bases or an airfield, would send a very nervous signal to our allies and to the Arab Gulf countries who've been supportive of what we're doing.
But several Pentagon sources said today that policy of restrained response may be cast aside if Iran strikes back. One senior official said, "We get more bang for our buck by hitting bigger targets, and we've told Iran just that," meaning the United States is prepared for a counterattack and, if necessary, a wider war. Fred Francis, NBC News, the Pentagon.
Iran threatened a crushing blow in retaliation for the latest U.S. attack. The warning was broadcast on Tehran television. The Iranians said that President Reagan committed a big mistake and definitely increased his problems. That warning was also sounded at the United Nations today by the ambassador there.
We condemn all these acts of aggression launched by the United States that has opened an all-out war against my country.
President Reagan said he had no desire for a military confrontation with Iran, but Iran should be under no illusion, he said, about U.S. determination. There was broad bipartisan support for the limited attack today, but as NBC's
Rostam multi-tower oil production platform complex in the middle of the Gulf. Today, the Rostam rig, which U.S. officials say served as a small Iranian military base, burned out of control. The smoke could be seen for 10 miles, but the message was meant for Tehran, 690 miles away. According to U.S. military officials, the platform complex, which had not been used for oil production for at least a year, had become a radar-equipped command and control center for Iran's Revolutionary Guards. Today, the tables were turned, and the platform was virtually pulverized by the big guns from this armada of 4 Navy guided missile destroyers. These pictures were taken 90 minutes before today's attack began. The USS Kidd, Young, Leftwich, and Hull were closing in on their target halfway between the Strait of Hormuz and the Fao Peninsula. It was from Fao that Iran is believed to have fired the long-range missile which last Friday struck the American flag tanker Sea Isle City, wounding many of her crew. All strategic Iranian Gulf locations, including Larak Island, were on red alert. The Iranian Navy today seemed even more nervous than usual, challenging the cargo of commercial ships.
What's the nature of cargo? What do you have in containers? Over.
Iranian nerves later escalated into Iranian anger over the attack. Iranian TV tonight showed pictures of what it reported to be an anti-American demonstration today in front of the former U.S. Embassy in Tehran. The Islamic news agency said the U.S. has become involved in a full-fledged war with Iran. The Iranian president, Ali Khamenei, is quoted as saying, "We will retaliate. Reagan has made a very serious mistake." Although there's been little formal reaction from Arab states in the region, the initial informal feedback has been supportive of the U.S. retaliation. But few leaders in this part of the world would expect this act by America to go unanswered by Iran. Mike Lee, ABC News, in the Gulf.
In Washington today, Reagan administration officials were quick to emphasize that in their view this was a limited military response. At the Pentagon, here's ABC's Bob Zelnick.
In retaliating against the Rostam oil platform, Defense Secretary Weinberger stressed the U.S. had chosen a military, not an economic target.
This platform had been used to mount radar surveillance, to report on convoy movements, to launch small boat attacks against non-belligerent shipping in the central Gulf waters, and last week to fire at U.S. military helicopters.
The operation appears to have been conducted with precision. 1/2 hour before the attack, the 4 destroyers deployed some 6,000 yards from the platform. 10 minutes later, the frigate Thatch began broadcasting warnings in both English and Farsi that the platform was about to be destroyed. The Iranians acknowledged the warning, and at least some of the 20 to 30 men on the platform were seen evacuating it. For about 45 minutes, the 4 destroyers blistered the platform with over 1,000 rounds of 5-inch shells. Navy SEALs were then sent in to destroy the underwater superstructure of the platform. After completing that work, the SEALs briefly occupied a second, now abandoned platform 5 miles to the east, destroying radar equipment and seizing some light weapons. There were no U.S. casualties. Ignored in today's attack were several targets of far greater military value, including the missile sites on the Fao Peninsula from which last week silkworms had been launched, and the big military base at Bandar Abbas. Among the reasons, these targets would have been harder to reach, costlier in terms of U.S. casualties, and would have gotten the U.S. more directly involved in the Iraq-Iran war. Weinberger said even this more modest effort packed a message to Iran.
What is important is for Iran to realize that they cannot make unprovoked attacks on neutral, non-belligerent, legitimate shipping in the Gulf without some cost to them.
But military leaders are not predicting an end to the violence.
I think they're a little frustrated to find ways to genuinely hurt us, but I suspect they'll keep searching.
Whenever we are attacked, we are entitled to defending ourselves, and we are going to do that.
The silent player in today's drama was Iraq, a nation which has squandered its advantage in aircraft and armor, but which now stands to benefit if American force is arrayed against Iran. Bob Zelnick, ABC News at the Pentagon.
Well, there's been a lot of reaction to this attack in the Gulf. When we come back, we'll have it.
in the United States Senate.
So far, most of this is just talk, staking out a position. The fact is that Judge Ginsburg's positions on such major issues as civil rights, abortion, and privacy are simply unknown to most senators. John Dancy, NBC News at the U.S. Capitol.
News, Dan Rather reporting. The prospect tonight of another fierce battle over President Reagan's new nominee to the Supreme Court. Douglas Ginsburg, 41-year-old federal appeals court judge in Washington, colleague of Robert Bork and said to be Bork's ideological soulmate. Even before the lines are drawn in the Senate, the Ginsburg nomination has already pitted White House pragmatists against the ideologically motivated true believers around President Reagan. The true believers won, the same ones who backed Bork, backed Ginsburg, and won it for him. White House correspondent Bill Plant begins our coverage of the new battle brewing.
President Reagan nominated another arch-conservative, Judge Douglas Ginsburg, to the Supreme Court, defying the coalition which defeated Robert Bork and over the advice of many of his White House advisors. Ginsburg is young, 41, and has been a federal appeals judge for barely a year.
Judge Ginsburg is, as I am, as every justice I've nominated has been, a believer in judicial restraint. That is, that the proper role of the courts is to interpret the law, not make it.
And I want to express my deep appreciation for the confidence you've placed in me and nominating me to be an Associate Justice of the Supreme Court.
Mr. Reagan pressed the Senate to act quickly before its holiday recess and to avoid the bitterness of the Bork battle.
I hope we can all resolve not to permit a repetition of the campaign of pressure politics that has so recently chilled the judicial selection process.
But there was some pressure politics inside the White House even before the nomination. Moderates, led by Chief of Staff Howard Baker, urged the president to select federal Judge Anthony Kennedy, whom they considered easily confirmable. But Attorney General Edwin Meese campaigned hard for the more conservative Ginsburg. And this morning, the president made his choice, seeming to keep the pledge he made 2 weeks ago as the Bork nomination was going down.
And if I have to appoint another one, I'll try to find one that they'll object to just as much as they did to this.
He has a chance to put a man on the bench who has the same propensities, the same philosophy as Judge Robert Bork, who's 20 years younger.
And perhaps for that very reason, Democrats are already skeptical of Ginsburg.
Anti-individual rights, anti-civil rights, anti-Bill of Rights. That's Meese's agenda. The question now becomes, is that the Ginsburg agenda? I do not know the answer to that question.
White House officials say they are trying to set the stage for a more dignified confirmation process than the last one, but they're faced with a lot of Democrats and a few Republicans who can't believe that Mr. Reagan threw down the conservative gauntlet again, and they're admitting that confirmation probably won't be easy. Dan?
Bill, what about these reports that North Carolina Senator Jesse Helms was the key in getting President Reagan to go as he did?
Dan, probably not the key, but a major factor. The conservatives believed that they could stop the nomination of Judge Kennedy on the floor, and they were prepared to try and do it. So the White House is going to set a different tone, try not to let the opposition form, and count on Ginsburg's lower profile for what they hope will be victory.
Thank you, Bill. Now, who is Douglas Ginsburg and what does he stand for? CBS News law correspondent Rita Braver, who first broke the Ginsburg nomination story this afternoon, has been checking around.
Good morning, sir. When CBS News caught up with Judge Ginsburg this morning, he didn't yet know he was the nominee, but he knew he was under consideration. Does he think he's confirmable?
I think the candidates that have been mentioned in the news in the last few days are all eminently confirmable.
Associates describe Ginsburg as brilliant and arrogant. A graduate of Cornell University and the University of Chicago Law School, he was a law clerk to Justice Thurgood Marshall, but is far more conservative than his old boss. Ginsburg first worked for the Reagan administration in the Budget Office. Later, he served as Assistant Attorney General for Antitrust. Most of his writings have been on economic issues.
What we know about Doug Ginsburg is that he is a proponent of free markets. He believes